Thank you very much, Dominic. Very informative. I'm now going to move swiftly on to our next speaker, Dr. Heiko Khoo, please.
I'm going to speak quite fast because I've got quite a lot of things to say. I'm talking specifically about COVID and China. That's the subject of this discussion. Starting point is, well, I can refer to the news today, for example. BBC today says that you can see on their website there's a big protest, or a protest broke out in Urumqi. That's the capital of the western area of China called Xinjiang province, where there's a lot of talk about camps and all that sort of thing. On these protests, the BBC gleefully reports that people shouted, "Down with the lockdowns." The BBC reports that people shouted, "Down with the lockdowns." And this is in Xinjiang, so you think these are angry people protesting against the lockdowns in Xinjiang, which they are. But why is the BBC taking that line? Why is the BBC suddenly anti-lockdowns and anti these things? There's a video, another video, running alongside this, circulating on the internet, showing the protesters on that day, yesterday, waving the Chinese flag and singing the national anthem. But you've got to understand what the Chinese national anthem is. The Chinese national anthem is a revolutionary anthem, like the Marseillaise. It starts with the words, "Arise, ye who refuse to be bond slaves," and it ends, "Rise up, rise up, rise up." So, what is going on in China? That's what I want to try and discuss with you and explain to you the background to it, how this is all connected in with the WHO, with the history of SARS and so on. So starting point, I'm going to refer to a paper that was published in 2017. These are all peer-reviewed documents I'm going to refer to unless they're specifically not. And it's a publication, let me find the paper. Well, I'll report it to you after, so I need to go through each one, but I'll pull it out here. 2017, and it studied pneumonias of unknown origin in Europe, particularly Netherlands and the United States of America, between 2010 and 2017. So they studied widespread the data banks of pneumonias of unknown origin in America and Europe. Now, they found that 50% of pneumonias were of unknown origin. 50%. So half of all the pneumonias in Europe, America, and so on, you can assume from that evidence, are of unknown origin. Then they said, of them, 25% were viral, but what virus, they didn't have any idea what it was. And many of them, I think a third of them, had at least two, either bacterial and viral, or 2 or 3 viruses present at the same time. So, in the West, we didn't bother to investigate what the actual cause of something is, or claim to investigate what the actual cause of something is. You just said the person got pneumonia, they died of it, or the person got pneumonia, they cured of it. I had pneumonia myself, 1995. No doctor turned around to me and said, "Oh, this is the cause. We found what you got," Nor did they even ask, I just put on some antibiotics, I recovered, and that was it. Gone. So there has never been an attempt in Europe or America to find out the origin of pneumonia, apart from the ones they know about. And in most cases, they don't bother to investigate. So then why, you ask yourself, was it in 2019, in December, when a handful of cases of pneumonia emerged in China, in Wuhan, that the whole world suddenly knew about it? And it was declared, a pneumonia of unknown origin has been discovered in China, in a handful of people. And then there was a report, you remember there was a guy called Li Wenliang, an eye doctor, 33 years of age. He worked in a hospital in Wuhan, and he spoke to a couple of his mates because there was a case of someone with pneumonia of unknown origin, and he thought it might be SARS. And so he said to his mates on WeChat, "I think there might be a SARS outbreak happening in Wuhan." He knew one case, one. And there were a handful of them, 5, 10 cases in the whole of Wuhan at that time they'd identified as pneumonia. How did they identify it? They identified it by putting these people in a CT scan, looking at their lungs, and if they had broken glass-like opacities in the lung, that was defined as a pneumonia of unknown origin. Now, there are different, supposedly viruses and bacteria that can cause broken glass opacities in both lungs. But this was a little bit different, they thought, so they said, well, this is something a bit different. It's similar to SARS, it looks like SARS. And then they sent off a genetic sequencing to Western data banks. And in a Western data bank, there's a man by the name of Christian Drosten, who many of you might have heard about in Germany, who works at the Charité University, and he looked at the sample put on the data bank, and he said, I've got the mechanism to identify 30 different strands within the RNA of 30,000 strand long, 30 strands of them identify this as something that we're going to call SARS-CoV-2, which he then said is the cause of the illness which has been identified in China as broken glass-like opacities in the lung through CT scans, i.e. pneumonia of viral origin. Now let me go backwards in time. In 2004, there was an outbreak of something called SARS, or said to be an outbreak of something called SARS in China. The WHO and the NHS website and every single academic paper in the entire planet says, except for one, says SARS is a respiratory illness that emerged in 2002 and disappeared from the face of the planet in 2004. That's what the WHO website says, that's what the NHS website says, that's what every paper says except one. And the one that doesn't say that is a peculiar source. And it's called, the paper was published in 2013, and it says SARS-CoV originated in bats in 1998 and may still exist in humans. The key thing here is one of the authors, the fourth author, is a man by the name of Nan Shanzhong. And Nan Shanzhong is the leading epidemiologist in China. He's the Anthony Fauci, the Patrick Vallance, the Chris Whitty, the RKI in Germany, all in one.
Oh my God.
He's like considered to be the Yuri Gagarin of China. He's the hero of China at the moment, or he was until a few months ago, for fighting SARS, one, and also for fighting SARS-CoV-2. But here in this paper, in 2013, he says, I'll read it out, anti-SARS-CoV seropositivity was detected in 20% of all samples tested from Guangzhou children who were born after 2005, a year after the disease disappeared, suggesting that weakly virulent SARS-CoV might still exist in humans. These existing undetected CoVs have a large potential to evolve into high virulent strains when favourable climatic conditions, and that's forbidden to say that, highlighting potential for a re-emergence of SARS. These were children between the ages of 5 and 7 years, or maximum 7 years of age. They were tested between 2010 and 2012, and they had 20% had antibodies to SARS. So, in other words, SARS never disappeared. So if SARS never disappeared, you don't need any origin for SARS-CoV-2. You just need genetic mutations taking place between man and animal, moving all the time. The way you get a mutation to these things, and I know there are some people who say there are no viruses, I'll come on to that in a minute. But if you get one type of SARS virus, coronavirus better said, and you get another type present in the same organism, a human, animal, whatever, at the same time, then they can exchange these points. And that makes a new variant or a new form. And that's why they're always going on about bloody new variants every couple of days. Now, so the first point is that SARS, according to Zhong Nanshan, and according to the records they made, the studies they made of antibodies and blood samples and so on in China, plasma samples actually, it never disappeared. Now, if it never disappeared, it didn't have to originate. Now, if in 2019 they found SARS-CoV-2, well, wasn't it a variant of SARS in the first place? So then the question comes, why did it suddenly become a big thing around the world? Li Wenliang, his story was taken up by the Western media and made a big story. And don't forget, there had been a long period of several years of campaigns against the Chinese government in Hong Kong financed by the British and the Americans, by the way. They were, no, there's not a dispute about this, whether you agree with them or not. They were financed and organised by the British and American intelligence agencies and British and American supporting NGOs and so on. What they call a colour revolution. They wanted to use Hong Kong as a launching ground to overthrow the government in China. Now, so the Chinese government has been confronted by the fact of a long period of, during the period of 1990 up until 2022, something like 500 million people have moved from the countryside to the city. These were people who were raised with animals on a daily basis. Tough, strong people who moved to the cities. These are the people now making the iPhones and so on in the factories in China and behind the protests in the last few days. Now, 500 million people moved to the cities, and when they did so, they didn't have healthcare rights. They didn't have the right to go to hospital or to get treatment. So they would go to either they go to Chinese traditional medicine, or they go to a local pharmacist, or if they really want to get treatment for something, say you've got lung cancer, you go to the big hospital in town and you join a queue. The queue starts early in the morning, and there are people who scout the queue. So they go there and they stand in the queue, and then they say, you want to pay me £500, I'll give you my position in the queue. So you can go there, and if you don't have money, you won't get seen by the doctor. But if you've got a bit of money, you can jump the queue and get to see the doctor. If you get to see the doctor and you've got, for example, lung cancer in China, the doctor will look at you and he'll check up your records of finances. And if you don't have enough money, he will say, okay, this is what you should take, some palliative medicine or Chinese traditional medicine, something like that. He won't recommend any expensive treatments because he knows you can't afford it. And therefore, some people go home and then they look up, oh, actually he's got cancer, he should take radiotherapy or something. So then they buy the ingredients for radiotherapy online and then try and make pills for their family or their parents and stuff like that. They don't have these resources. The medical system in China broke down after this migration of people from the countryside to the cities. They used to have something called the barefoot doctors, and they went into the countryside between 1949 and 1976, 1980, and they used to basically provide very elementary medical provision, Chinese traditional medicine and some Western medicine, and also some environmental changes, remove pollution, that sort of thing. And that created a huge improvement in the living standard, in the life expectancy of the population, the health of the population. But that collapsed after 1979 up until about 1990. So everything became focused in the cities. Chinese medical treatment is divided in two different types: Chinese traditional medicine and Western medicine. Western medicine doctors generally received some training in the West. A lot went to America, a lot went to Europe, they were sponsored, they got support, there was support from the Western organisations to promote Western medicine inside China. But in China officially, the government has always said medicine walks on two legs. One is traditional medicine. Traditional medicine is herbs, spices and so on, that type of thing, but also some weird things, animal bits and all that sort of thing. And Western medicine, which we're all familiar with. So Chinese traditional medicine, just to come on to that question, just quickly as a sideline, this is the recommendation from the Sichuan government, published last month, as to what you should do to control SARS, to control coronavirus. And you're going to laugh because this is forbidden in England, but anyway, this is the technical guideline from October 22 for prevention of SARS-CoV-2, of coronavirus. Normal preventative prescription: 15 grams of mulberry leaves, 15 grams of chrysanthemum, 15 grams of almonds, 15 grams of forsythia, 15 grams of mint, 30 grams of bellflower, 15 grams of licorice, 30 grams of reed root, and 30 grams of honeysuckle. And then there's treatments, which are all the same, they're all using it, but in different variations. Yeah? So that's what official government sources in China, this is the Sichuan government, it's a province with a population of about 100 million, or about 100 something million. And that's what they're telling people to take as official recommendation, unless you take Western medicine. What was the Western medicine that was used in China at the beginning of the outbreak? What did they give them? Hydroxychloroquine is what they gave them. It was everybody received hydroxychloroquine and Chinese traditional medicine. So in that respect, they were far better than what we did here. Far better than what we did here. Now, why did China lock down? Between the period January the 10th and January the 23rd, 2020, Wuhan, the whole of China was on the move. Basically, it's called Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year, half the population move. They go from the cities they work in back to their homelands, visit their family, and so on. So all these hundreds of millions of migrant workers returned home during that period. Now, in Wuhan itself, that was 5 million out of 11 million people. So 5 million people left the city in the 10 days before the lockdown came in Wuhan. And yet, of those 5 million people, there was barely a notice of anything at all happened. Those people, you would have thought, and that's why the government locked down, they thought, this is going to break out, spread everywhere, it's going to be SARS. And so they got a panic. And they were panicked by Western media saying, China didn't do anything in SARS, they messed up, they let it spread, they let the disease nearly rip through the whole world, destroy the world, had a 3% fatality rate, and only because the Chinese, under recommendation from the WHO, locked down the airlines and checked the temperatures and wore masks and all that in 2004, that's why SARS disappeared, that's what they said. And of course they stopped testing for it, so of course it disappeared. Coming back to which Christian Drosten made the test in 2004. And when he made the test, the PCR test in 2004 for SARS, the first SARS, he wrote, when he made the first test, he said, we've detected this peculiar strands of RNA, but we're not sure if it actually causes the disease. At that time, at least, he was honest. We're not sure. Later, he published a change, and he said, it is what causes the disease. We know it's what causes the disease. But they didn't know whether it caused the disease at all. So, coming back to the present, to 2019, Li Wenliang's story went global. And of course, in China, it's perfectly true. It's a dictatorship. The government controls basically pretty much everything. And they don't like stories getting out, bad stories getting out. So suddenly there was this story, there's a disease breaking out, a doctor's trying to tell everyone, the Chinese government not telling anyone, they're hiding it, they're concealing it. Surely that's going to cause rebellion in China because they're hiding things from the population. People are going to die. No one's doing anything. So what did they do? They locked down. And they locked down from 23rd of January in Wuhan and Hubei province, a province of 65 million people. Half of China has never had any lockdown at all. Hong Kong never had any lockdown, Taiwan never had any lockdown, and large parts of China they've got the biggest lockdowns they've ever had now, but it's still only less than half of China. So more than half of China has never had a lockdown. They got up, but on the 8th of February 2020, less than 3 weeks after the first lockdown was imposed, Xi Jinping said, reopen. Nothing's happened. Why did he? Because he knew from the reports of the migrant workers who had moved, half the population of Wuhan nearly, 40%, that nothing had happened. And so he knew nothing was going on. And Zhong Nanshan, the guy who did this report and is the lead epidemiologist, he told him that as well. And so they said, open up. But what happened? They didn't open up. Local governments basically refused to open up. They refused to open up because they feared they might get trouble. What if we open up and there's an outbreak? What if people start dying? Why do they fear these people? Because in China, the main focus of protest for 20 years has been what's called Yinao, and Yinao is medical unrest. And I can find you paper after paper here in Chinese where you look it up and you say medical unrest, you type it in and it says, in China, it's normal for people to protest at hospitals. In fact, they made an explicit law after COVID happened that said you can no longer kill doctors or protest at hospitals, beat up doctors and nurses. And there was some protest by doctors and nurses because they kept getting beaten up and attacked. And the consequence of that was that a lot of people were scared to become doctors because a lot of doctors were corrupt. And precisely this thing, you come for treatment, I give you proper treatment because you pay me money. He comes, he hasn't got money, he doesn't get the treatment. So of course you turn and say, look, who the hell are you? So the migrant workers, what they did was, there was even an industry associated with it. New adverts in the newspapers. Do you want a protester to stand outside the hospital? Pay us £100 and we'll stand outside there all day. Pay us £200 and we'll moan and scream outside and say, you killed my uncle, you killed my uncle. Pay us £500, we'll beat up someone at the hospital and that sort of thing. So it's an industry to campaign to get medical compensation. And the hospitals generally gave in, and if the police came, the police would side with the protesters. So it's quite different to what I'm trying to present to you. What I know about China is quite different to what we're being told. So when they got over the lockdown, and that was in 8th of April 2020, they suddenly reopened. Remember, and when we had locked down, they were reopening, and they had this music festivals and things like that, but they closed the borders off. So no one could come in, or no one could come in. China was closed off. So just like New Zealand and Australia, you know, we're sealed off, we're not going to get this disease. And of course, how many people got pneumonia in China? Who cared? No one knew. So, having said, what time have we got to finish?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So, when they reopened, the Chinese were very happy. Look, we've achieved, you know. And then they watched the world, and all the world's newspapers and news outlets would say, everyone's dying of coronavirus all around the world. Look at America, all these people dying. Look at Italy, look at England. We're locked down. Now the figure is 6 million dead, right? That's what's more than 6 million dead. You know, like the Holocaust, that's what they're saying. Because we all know that's bullshit. But the Chinese didn't know. The Chinese population thought, well, our government's done such a good thing. They locked the country down, saved all our lives, while the rest of the world is dying like flies, right? That's the story that naturally was believed. Now, they started to lock down again only the beginning of this year. Madness, but they did it. Again, this is because of internal pressure politically in society. Because for a long period of time, between 2020 to 2020, 2015 or so, actually more 2010, you know, when the economic crisis hit, you know, 2009, 2010, the big global economic crisis, China had been pushing for privatization of pretty much of everything. It was moving towards handing over everything to a few billionaires, you know, Jack Ma and these people were going to take over everything, a few tech giants, it was going to be like America. And then they could like hold an election, have a regime like West. But the pressure from below, from these migrant workers, to have a better life, to have good conditions, to have welfare rights, to have a healthcare system, to have good housing, all these type of things, was very strong. And so that pressure pushed the party to push in a different direction. And that different direction which they were pushed in was to re-centralise control and to provide welfare for the people. So what happened then when Wuhan, just as a side note, when Wuhan first locked down, the government said, all treatment for pneumonia and COVID-like illnesses will be free. So of course what happened? Every Tom, Dick and Harry ran to the hospital and said, I've got a lung problem, you're going to treat me for free. So they all ended up, and there was huge scenes of people struggling to get treatment in the hospitals. They can get it for free suddenly, out of nothing. But then, right, so coming on to now, we've got a few minutes left. So what's the difference in China? Treatment for COVID was, as I said, TCM, hydroxychloroquine. The vaccine. In China, the vaccine is an inactivated virus. It's not an mRNA vaccine. Now, it does cause injuries. It causes deafness in some people. It's got aluminium adjuvants. And like all vaccines, like flu vaccine, all this sort of thing, you know, you might well say that it causes more damage than it benefits. You might well say that. The interesting thing is, however, who are the people who are refusing to take the vaccines? You know, you think China, well, it's an authoritarian state, they can demand everyone takes the vaccine. Here the Financial Times from yesterday. It says, the big problem lies in Chinese culture, which is more risk-averse than many other countries when it comes to diseases and vaccines. So says an analyst from the China consultancy Trivium. While a relatively high vaccine hesitancy rate amongst China's elderly population predates the pandemic, the problem has been exacerbated by official messaging about the dangers of COVID over the past 2.5 years. Despite the Communist Party's enormous power of social control, ordering the elderly to vaccinate is viewed as a step too far, even for Xi, because of fears it would spark, quote, dramatic social resistance, unquote. The elderly, who in the West, the elderly were carted off to go and get vaccines. But in China, the elderly, they come from a different generation of thinking. They take Chinese traditional medicine, they do exercise in the park in the morning, they do Tai Chi, they do Qigong, they do dancing, all that sort of thing. They're physically fit. For 70 and 80-year-olds, they're physically fit. and they refuse to take vaccines. Now, what the pressure on this is about is that the Western powers want them to take mRNA vaccines. Because if they take mRNA vaccines, they say, these are effective and the Chinese ones not. If they take mRNA vaccines, it will mean they've got a market for 1 billion more people for this bullshit that they're serving up to us. So that's the game behind it. So this is not to say anything supportive of the Chinese government or anything like this. I'm describing what I know has happened in China. And the dynamics, of course, is slightly different in China. In the West, if you've got a government that doesn't do what you want, you can put some pressure, we know from demonstrating and so on, you can put pressure, and eventually, if they're really put against the wall, what do? Call an election! And put another puppet in. So when they're really in danger, out goes Rishi Sunak, in comes Keir Starmer. Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They don't have that option in China. There's only one government, one party, at least in control. And therefore they're much more susceptible to pressure from below. If there are demonstrations, which I think is about to happen, if there are demonstrations of 5,000 in any of the major cities in China, the government policy will change. But they won't say it's caused by the protest, nor did they say it here, by the way, don't forget. We protested in February. When in February the protests happened, suddenly the government changed its mind, boom, 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 boom. The Canadian protests, suddenly the government changed its mind, boom, boom, boom. No more restrictions. Suddenly in Europe they were saying, mandate, you must get the change, you can't go anywhere. Suddenly all gone. Because the protests were large enough to put pressure on the authorities. In China, the protests will be smaller to require to put pressure on the authorities. Because of the nature of the way in which power operates in China, they will be more fearful. And they will know that if that 5,000 takes to the streets and march around, because there's no outlet for alternative views, so it will bring down the government. And therefore the government will withdraw. They've tested it last week, Shuzhou, a town outside Beijing. They removed the COVID restriction. They removed the COVID testing restrictions, which are insane. They test every couple of days. They removed the COVID testing restrictions and said, okay, that's all free. And now they're beginning to say, oh, some of the testing companies have been ripping us off and been jacking up the numbers. No, jacking up how many people are supposed to have COVID. So basically, the key workers have gained too much power, or they said, asserted their authority. I am in charge. I decide who comes in and out of this building. It's that type of, the dickheads who are on the door at Sainsbury's, multiplied by 100 times. That's what's basically taken over in China. And but as a result of these pressures, you know what I mean? So I try to present a nuanced view, at least to allow you to understand what's really going on and how the West is approaching that. So what we see in the news about this will be different to what's actually taking place in the country. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Heiko. A fascinating insight into China, what's really going on there, which I think most of us are in the dark about. So thank you again. Well done.